Okay, in labor market equilibrium 4B, lesson one, we're going to look at the effects of a tax in the labor market has on the employment level and the wages that are paid net of the taxes to the employees and the cost net of the tax to the individual firms, right? So what we have to do is we start off do the analysis by clicking on this. You will open up, that will open up this Desmos.com model. And what we want to do is we want to set, this is the labor demand equation, right? This is the demand's slope. So we want to set the parameters of our model up, right? So our demand, if you look at just the absolute value of demand, right? The slope, the absolute value of the demand slope is 0.35. The intercept is 24.32, right? 24.32, right? The supply slope is 0.65. And the supply intercept is 2.5. Okay. Okay, so this line here is the demand line, right? Labor demand. And this line here is the labor supply. Okay. And supply is steeper than demand. So labor supply, employees' labor supply is relatively more inelastic than demand, which is why the firm surplus is the triangle produced by these three dots, right? We talked about that last week, right? The employer surplus, the firm surplus here is this blue triangle, right? And the height of the blue triangle is 24.32 minus 16.683, right? That's the height of the triangle. The width of the triangle is the 21.82. This is the equilibrium level of equilibrium amount of laborers hired by the firms, right? 21.82. Okay, so to find the employer surplus or the firm surplus, you take this difference in these two heights here, 24.32 minus 16.83, and you multiply it by 21.82, the length of the triangle. And you divide that product by 2 to get the area of the triangle, right? So the firm surplus, the blue area, is smaller than the red area, right? And the red area is the worker surplus. And it is found by first finding the height of the triangle, which is 16.83 subtracted less the 2.5, right? That gives you the height of the triangle. Then you multiply that by the 21.82, the width of the triangle. And then you divide that product by 2. And worker surplus is larger than firm surplus because labor supply is more inelastic than demand. Demand is more elastic. Labor supply is more inelastic, right? Okay. So to find the equilibrium employment level, right? To find the equilibrium employment level, that's the intersection of demand and supply, correct? So the equilibrium employment level is the first number because E is in the place of X, right? And W is in the place of Y. And this is the Y-axis, and this is the X-axis. So the employment level, right, is 21.82. That's the equilibrium employment level, right? Now, the marginal firm, right? The marginal firm is going to be probably a high-cost producer, a small high-cost producer, because if the wage goes up a little bit, their margins are so small that they may exit the market. They may stop employing labor. So marginal firms tend to have a higher cost per unit than the other firms that are hiring out of the same labor market, right? So the marginal firm is willing to pay a wage of 16.68, right? That's the maximum we're willing to pay this last worker hired, right? 16.8. And that just happens to be equal to the market wage, right? So this marginal firm is indifferent between hiring this last worker, hiring them or not hiring them. They're indifferent, right? So that's 16.8, 16.68, sorry, right? Now that last worker hired is the marginal employee. Why? Because when you plug this employment level into the labor supply equation, you get a reservation wage of 21.82, which happens to be equal, 16.68, which happens to be equal to market wage, 16.68, right? So the marginal employee, that marginal employee has zero worker surplus because they're indifferent between working or not working because they're getting paid the market wage, and that's the lowest wage they'd be willing to do the job for, right? Meanwhile, the marginal firm is indifferent between hiring this person because they're willing to pay at most $16.60 for this worker, which is the market wage. So the firm surplus for the marginal firm of that last employee hired is zero as well, right? Now, suppose politicians have just enacted an increase in the unemployment insurance tax that will be levied on firms. The proceeds from this tax, the revenue generated in this tax, it's to be used to increase the amount of money the government gives unemployed workers to live on while they look for a new job. Now, those intentions are noble, right? I see why politicians would be in favor of that. As an economist, our job is not to, celebrate the intentions of policymakers. I think it personally is to understand the consequences of policies that are intended to do good, right? So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to understand what the consequences are of this kind of policy, right? Are the consequences generally good? Or are the consequences generally bad? We're going to find out, right? Okay, so as an economist, maybe you've estimated the labor demand and the labor supply in this market, and you observe employment fell by 30%, right? You observe that. So what are you going to do? Well, we can actually figure out what the dollar per unit tax is if we've estimated labor demand and labor supply, and we observe how much labor declines by as a result of the tax, right? So let's put all three of those together. I'm going to start a new Desmos model, right? In this Desmos model, we have to reset it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this here to a blank Desmos, right? I'm going to copy this to that same blank Desmos. So this model here matches the one that I linked up to the problem, right? So that when you click this link and you update these parameters, you get this model. Well, when I copy this and that to a blank Desmos, I get the same exact model, right? And you can see that by clicking right here. The quantity of labor supplied and the quantity of labor demanded, they're both equal to 21.82, right? Which is exactly what we had here, right? And then the market wage is 16.68, right? Okay, so let's do this. Let's calculate what the new employment level will be after the tax is imposed. Because when you tax something, if you tax labor, you're going to get less employees. You're going to get less labor demand, and you're going to get less labor supply, or both, right? So you're going to get less of it. So we observed a 30% decline in the employment level. And the employment level, again, was 21.82 initially, right? 21.82 is the initial employment level. But we observed a 30% decrease, right? So the decrease in employment, the number of employees, is 6.546. Now, that could be in millions or thousands, right? Depending on how big this labor market is. It's the lowest skilled labor market, so maybe this is in millions of laborers, right? For a big country, this could be in millions of laborers. For a smaller country, it would probably be in thousands. All right. Now, if I do this, if I type E equals, right? Whoops, sorry. I don't want to do that yet. This is the amount that the labor employment number falls by, right? This is the decline in the employment level. So what we needed is we need to subtract this quantity, 6.546, from the initial employment level. And the initial employment level is 21.82, right? So the decline, right? This represents the decline, the 30% decline in employment level. When we subtract that from the initial employment level, we get the final employment level, right? Y'all see that? We get the final employment level. So let's just copy this number here. We'll copy that and place it right here. So the new employment level, which is 30% less than the initial employment level, right? The new employment level is 15.274. And that produces this vertical dashed line here, right? So this value here is 21.82, right? 21.82 million of employees. This dashed line is at 15.274 million employees, right? So this is what the employment level shrinks to. It goes from 21.82 down to 15.274, right? Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to take this number and plug it into our labor demand equation, right? When we plug this number, 15.274, we're going to plug it into our labor demand equation, and the resulting number should be bigger than 18, right? Maybe it's about 19 something, right? And it's higher than the initial equilibrium wage, right? The initial equilibrium wage is 16.68. That's a height of 16.68, right? So this might be like 19 point something or almost 20 point something, right? So we're going to plug this value into our labor demand equation. So in order to do that in Desmos, here's my original model, right? Here's that blank one that I'm working with. This is my working model. I'm going to put an E in front of this difference. And so the employment level is now 15.274, right? This dashed line quantity, right? And what Desmos does here is it takes this 15.274 and it plugs it into this E here, multiplies it by 0.35, and then subtracts that product from 24.32 to get 18.97, right? So the maximum wage that firms are willing to pay this new marginal employee, the last one hired after the tax, the highest they're willing to pay that particular employee is 18.97, right? Almost 19, right? I said it was probably about 19, right? But it's actually 18.97, right? That's the most they're now willing to pay that new marginal employee after the tax is imposed, right? Now, when we substitute this new employment level into the labor supply equation, we get the reservation wage of the new marginal employee, the last employee hired, right? And that looks like it's just above 12, correct? Looks like it's just above 12. So the new reservation wage of the new marginal employee, the last employee hired after the tax is imposed, that reservation wage is what? Well, again, right, after calculating the 30% decline in employment and subtracting that from the initial employment level, we get a new employment level of 15.274, right? We replace 15.274 with, we replace E with 15.274. We multiply that by 0.65. We add that product to 2.5. We get a new reservation wage of 12.43 when we round this to 2 decimal places, right? We get 12.43, right? Okay, so this height here, 12.43, is this dashed line height, right? 12.43. And this height up here, this dashed line, is 18.97, right? 18.97. Okay, and the difference in the height of this dashed line and that dashed line is the dollar amount of the tax, right? So in order to get the dollar amount of the tax, we got to subtract this value and this value, right? So 18.97 minus 12.43, that's the amount of the tax in dollars. So the amount of tax in dollars is 6.54, right? 6.54. Now, when I hit enter, check out what happens in my graph, right? It shifts the labor demand equation down. It shifts it to the left, right? Labor demand is shifted from black to blue, right? That's a decrease in labor demand. Again, when you tax something, you get less of it. If you tax firms' labor demand, you're going to get less labor demand, right? So so clicking the submit button on that shows what? It shows how the tax reduces low-skilled labor demand. Labor supply is unaffected because labor supply wasn't taxed, right? Workers weren't taxed. Firms were taxed directly, right? Workers were not taxed. They end up being taxed indirectly, right? But the firms are taxed directly, right? Okay, so when we hit enter now, we get this red box here, right? The height of this red box, the height of the red box is the dollar value of the tax per hour, right? And the width of the width of this red box is the employment level. And the employment level is 15.274, right? And the height of this box is the tax of 6.54, right? Because it's the difference in the maximum wage firms are willing to pay this new marginal worker versus that marginal worker's reservation wage, right? And we calculated that tax be $6.54 per hour, right? So if I multiply this tax by the employment level, right? The new employment level, 15.274, I get a tax revenue of $99.89 per hour, right? $99.89 per hour. Now, if this is in millions down here, then this is in millions per hour, which is a lot of money, right? That's a lot of money, millions per hour, right? Okay, so now notice there's a dashed line here. This dashed line, if you extend it, goes to the original equilibrium point, right? So this was the out-of-pocket cost of a worker per hour to the firm, right? Before the tax, right? And this is the out-of-pocket cost to the firm after the tax. So this upper box here, that's the burden of the tax to the employers, right? So how do we calculate this box, the area of this upper box? Well, we have to subtract this maximum wage firms will want to pay the new marginal worker, 18.97. We have to subtract this 18.97 and the original wage, right? The original wage is 16.68. So this right here is 16.68. And this up here is the maximum wage firms will pay after the tax to each employee per hour, right? So we got to take that difference. So I'm going to do that right here, right? I'm going to do that right here. I'm going to get rid of the employment level, right? And the 18.97 is the height of this red box here, right? 18.97. We're going to subtract off the original equilibrium wage of 16.68. Okay, so in terms of dollars per hour, right? The firm pays $2.29 of this 6.654. Now, the firm is cutting the check for the 6.654, right? So they, again, don't want to pay all of this, right? They want to ship it as much as they can to the employees in the form of lower wage offers, right? It shifts most of it, not all of it. It shifts it to the employer with the exception of 229, right? So its burden of the tax is 2.29, right? And that's why this little box is highlighted here, right? This red box is the area of this red box is the firm's burden per hour, right? It shifts this down here onto the workers via lower wage offer, right? Via lower wage offer, right? Okay, so what's the area of this red box? The area of the red box is the height, 2.29 that we calculated here, right? Times our new employment level. And our new employment level is 15.274, right? So the red box is the firm's burden of the tax. So they're gonna pay 34.98, right? They're gonna pay $34.98 per hour, right, on behalf of the employees to the federal government. We're gonna make that 9.7 a 9.8 when we round it 2 decimal places. Okay, so the height of this box is the 2.99, right? Or the 2.29. The height of the box is the 2.29, right? The area of this box is 34.98, right? 34.98, the area of that box, right? Now what do we want to do? Now we want to do what? We want to calculate the amount of the tax that firms have to pay that is transferred to the employees via a lower wage rate, right? In order to calculate that, we need to subtract this reservation wage of that new marginal employee. The new marginal employee is the last worker hired after the tax is imposed. So that reservation wage is 12.43, and we want to subtract that from the initial market wage, right? So the initial market wage is 16.68, right? Minus this reservation wage, 12.43. So the firm would like the employees to cover all of the $6.54 per hour tax. They would like the employees to pay it all, right? But they can only get the employees to pay part of it. So their burden per hour is $2.29. The difference in these two, right? The difference in these two is $4.25. $4.25. So I can take the difference of these two, right? Or I can take the difference of this and the initial equilibrium wage. And either way, I get 4.25. So although the employees aren't writing the check to the government, the employers are, the firms are. The firms can shift their tax burden, a lot of it, most of it, to the employees in the form of a lower wage offer, right? They're only gonna offer employees this wage. In my model, 12.43, right? So that's how they're able to shift this tax, most of it, to the employee, right? The worker, right? So now we've got to calculate the revenues that government collects from firms that is shifted to the employee, that firm shifted the employee via a lower tax, a lower wage offer, right? So we have to calculate the area of this box here, right? Which is the new employment level times the amount of the tax. So all we have to do here is all we have to do is multiply the portion of the hourly tax in dollars that is shifted to the employee times the number of employees, right? And again, if this is in millions, this is in millions, right? So that's a pretty big tax, $64.91 million, right? Now, another way to calculate this would be to do what? You could subtract the firm's burden of the tax from the tax revenue that government collects. So this 99.89 minus the 34.98 equals the 64.91, right? So this plus that equals the tax revenue government collects, right? So this red box shows the burden that the employees pay is larger than the tax burden of the employers. And this is all made possible by the fact that the employer who is taxed is trying to pass the tax off onto their workers and is able to successfully do most of that shifting because they can offer employees a much lower wage, right? And that low wage offer is possible because the supply curve is relatively more inelastic than the demand curve, right? So although the tax was levied on employers, their burden is less than that of the employees, right? Okay, so again, this is the tax burden of the employers, and this is the tax burden of the employers that was shifted successfully to the workers via this low wage offer. Okay. Now, suppose the above tax delineates the low cost firm. Let me go back to here. Okay. So we had a tax of how much? We had a tax of 654. So I need to make this negative 6.54. This upper rectangle is this green upper rectangle between these dashed lines. And this lower rectangle, right, is this lower rectangle here, right? This bigger green rectangle is the employee tax burden, and this smaller green rectangle is the employer tax burden. Okay. So now suppose the tax delineates the large low-cost firm. It has the profit margin to survive the increase in the payroll tax. And small high-cost firms, right? Small high-cost firms, right? So what we're saying there is, suppose all these laborers work at low-cost large firms, and all these workers from 15 out here, all these workers here, they work at the high-cost smaller firms. So the small-cost higher firms, they're willing to and able to pay these wages, right? Why are they willing to pay lower wages on average than the high-cost large firm or the low-cost large firms? The low-cost large firms right here, they are willing to pay a higher wage, right, to employees because their margins are better. They got lower cost. These wage offers, these willingness to pay here, the smaller high-cost firms, their cost structures are higher, which means they can afford to pay less on average. They're willing to pay less on average than the large low-cost firms, right? So you think of the employees that are hired here, they're working at the low-cost firm, large low-cost firm, and these employees here are working at the high-cost small firms, right? Okay. And the same thing is going on in terms of supply curve, right? The supply curve here. This tax delineates the migrant workers, separates the migrant workers from native-born workers. Native-born workers, the lowest reservation wage of the native-born workers is thus 12.43, right? The highest reservation wage of native-born workers is 16.68, right? So this is the native-born worker with the lowest reservation wage. This is the native-born worker with the highest reservation wage. So all these workers on this labor supply curve are native-born. The migrant workers, their reservation wages range from 2.5 per hour to 12.43 per hour. So the migrant worker with the highest reservation wage is 12.43. The reservation wage, the lowest reservation wage of the migrant workers is 2.5. So migrant workers populate this labor supply curve. Native-born workers populate this part of the labor supply curve, right? That's what we're saying here, right? So what that means is there are 15.274 employees working for the low-cost firms, right? That's what this is right here, right? That's what this right here. All these are migrant workers working for the low-cost firm. And the difference between this employment level here, the difference between this employment level here and the employment level there, that difference is the 6.546, right? Okay. So there's 6.546 employees working for small high-cost firms, and those 6.546 employees are all native workers, right? There are 15.274 employees working for the large low-cost firm, and there are 15.274 migrant workers, right? So we're going to use this tax to delineate the low-cost firm, the large low-cost firm from the small high-cost firms, and migrant workers from native workers, okay? So after the payroll tax is increased, the number of employees working for small high-cost firms declines, right? It declines by this value here, right? Again, this value is the difference between employment at this point and employment at this point, right? And all of them lose their job, right? Employment at the small high-cost firms declines to 0. It declines by 6.546. So it was 6.546. It's now 0. And that difference is 6.546, right? Okay, now to calculate, so this triangle here, this triangle determined by these points right here, right? This triangle here, this white triangle, is before the tax. That triangle there was the employer surplus of the high-cost small firms. But these firms are all put out of business because they can't afford the higher property tax. Their margins are small, right? So they're put out of business. Okay, so this triangle represents two things. It represents their initial. It represents their initial. It represents the small high-cost firms' original firm surplus in this labor market. But it also represents the loss in their firm surplus that results from the payroll tax being imposed in this labor market. They don't survive, right? So this represents the loss post-tax, right? So we need to calculate that area, right? And the way we're going to calculate it is the difference in employment from this point to that point is the 6.546, right? If I subtract this employment level and this employment level, I take that difference, right? The difference in these two values is the 6.546. So that right there is the width of the triangle, right? So the width of the triangle is that value, right? And we're going to multiply that by the height of the triangle, right? We're going to multiply that by the height of the triangle. And the original equilibrium wage was 16.83, right? So the original equilibrium wage was 16.68, right? The wage that is paid after the tax, including the tax, right, is 18.97, right? That value. The second number at each point is the wage rate. The first number in each point is the employment level, right? So firms are willing to pay up to 18.97 for this now smaller number of employees, right? So with the upper white triangle is the width of the triangle, right? The 6.546 loss of employees, the number of employees lost their jobs, and they all happen to be, by assumption, native-born workers. And then the height of the triangle. And then we have to do what? We have to divide by 2, right? We have to divide by 2. So I need to calculate that value, right? This is the loss in employer surplus to the high-cost small firms, right? And I get 7.50, 7.50. Now, again, this is in millions, and we're talking about millions of employees, right? Okay. Now, the number of native-born workers employed, right? The number of native-born workers employed. Remember what we assumed. The native worker with the lowest reservation wage is 12.43. The native with the highest reservation wage is 16.83, right? So these people here are all native-born workers, right? From the one with the lowest reservation wage of 12.43 to the one with the highest reservation wage of 16.68, right? So these are all native-born workers. And the decline from this point to that point in terms of employment was the 6.546 employees, right? Again, if that's in terms of millions, that's quite a few, right? So there were 6.546 million native-born workers employed prior to the tax, right? This number plus this number totals the employment level before the tax, right? Oh, notice this little red triangle here. I draw the red triangle here for you, right? This is the loss in surplus to the small high-cost firms. They're out of business now, right? And this is the loss in their gains to trade, right? Okay. So the number of employees hired by these small high-cost firms is 6.546. They were all native-born workers, right? So now we need to calculate this triangle here, right? With this width being the difference, again, what employment was before 21.82 and what employment is now 15.274, right? So the width of this triangle is the difference in these two, right? And I give it to you down here. I give it to you right there, right? In the assumption that the tax separates low-cost firms from high-cost firms and native-born workers from migrant workers, right? So now we got to calculate this triangle here, right? We got to calculate the area of this triangle because this is the loss in worker surplus of native-born workers. This is what their worker surplus was prior to the tax, right? Native-born workers surplus prior to the tax was this triangle here, right? This white one. The tax results in this being a loss, right? This whole thing is the loss in surplus to native-born workers, right? So how do we calculate that? Well, the area of that triangle, right? The width of that triangle is still the 6.546 decline in the employment level, right? Because all those were native-born workers, right? Working at high-cost small firms. Okay. The width of the height of the triangle is the original market wage, 16.68, right? 16.68 minus the reservation wage of the new marginal worker, right? And that reservation wage is 12.43. So this right here is the original market wage, right? And this right here is the highest wage firms are willing to pay after the tax per hour to employees. And this is the reservation wage of the new marginal worker, the last worker hired when this payroll tax is imposed, right? And this worker surplus of native born workers, that's 13.91, right? And again, if the number of employees is in terms of millions, this is $13.91 million per hour, right? Okay. So the payroll tax increase was intended to provide more generous unemployment benefits for those who lost their jobs. It caused owners of small high-cost firms to close their doors, and it resulted in native workers losing their jobs. Both these effects increase unemployment, which increases unemployment program expenditures, right? So the goal of the tax was to provide greater benefits, weekly benefits to unemployed workers. But what it did is it may have done that, right? But what it also did is it made more people unemployed. It added to the unemployment. It added to the number of people unemployed. So it made unemployment worse, right? Now, before the payroll tax increased, the large low-cost firms' employer surplus was equal to what, right? So let's go back to here. See if it's drawn up here. So what we have to do now is, before the tax, right? This was the market wage before the tax. This little triangle here was the firm surplus of the small high-cost firms, right? Before the tax was in place, this upper rectangle, right? And this triangle here, that was the firm surplus, right? That was the firm surplus prior to the tax. And then firm surplus reduces to this, just the triangle. It reduces just to the triangle here after the tax, because this is part of the tax revenue that firms send to the federal government, right? So the quadrilateral that is defined by this dashed line up to the demand curve, along the demand curve, and then down to this dashed line, that quadrilateral is firm surplus prior to tax, the firm surplus of the large low-cost firms, right? And then it falls, as a result of the tax, it falls to just this triangle, right? So now we need to calculate that, right? Okay, so before the payroll tax increase, the large low-cost firm's employer surplus was equal to what? Okay, we're going to make some calculations here. So let's calculate the firm surplus. Let's calculate the firm surplus after the tax, right? That's this number here. We're going to calculate this first. It's going to make it easier, right? All right, so we're going to calculate the firm surplus, this blue triangle, after the tax is imposed, right? Again, this is the firm surplus of the high cost small firms. And this blue triangle here is the firm surplus of low cost large firms after the tax, right? So to find this, we need the height of the triangle, right? The height of the triangle is 24.32 minus 18.97, right? So let's change this to 24.32 minus 18.92 minus 18.972, right? So this is the height. This difference is the height of this blue triangle here, right? That height. Now, what's the width of this? Well, remember, by assumption, right? 15.274 migrant workers worked for the large low-cost firm, right? So the width of this triangle, right, is the 15.274, right? Width of this triangle, right? The width of this triangle is 15.274. In decimals, it says 15.28, but it's actually 15.27, right? So the width of this triangle is, 15.274, right? We're going to copy and calculate that in Desmos. Okay, so the firm surplus after the tax is imposed that accrues to the large low-cost firms is this blue triangle, right? And that's 40.84. Again, that's in millions of dollars if we're talking about millions of employees, right? It's this one here. It's the second one. Okay. All right. Now we need to get the firm surplus of these large low-cost firms prior to the tax, right? Okay, so prior to the tax, the firm surplus of the large low-cost firms is this green rectangle, the top green rectangle, right? Plus this blue triangle. Because remember, this was firm surplus of the small high-cost firms, right? That's the firm surplus of the small high-cost firms. This big triangle that goes to the initial equilibrium, right? It includes the blue, the green, and the white here. This big triangle is total firm surplus, right? Before the tax. But this chunk here was the total surplus of small high-cost firms, which means this rectangle here, this green rectangle, and this blue triangle is the firm surplus of low-cost large firms prior to the tax. So we have to add this area here, right? We have to add this area to that area. And what was this area? That was, this green area is the firm's burden, right? That green area is the firm's burden, 34.98, right? This is 34.98 here. Remember we calculated that? The portion of the tax paid by all the employers in this market equals $34.98 per hour, right? That's what this was. This is the firm's burden, right? The height of this box, from this point to that point, right, was a 2.29. But the area of this box was the 34.98. So let's go ahead and add that to here, right? So we're going to add this amount to that upper triangle, right? And we get 75.822. To two decimal places, firm surplus started at $75.82. Okay, so these were initially marked wrong. And the reason why is because I had an extra decimal place in here. The 18.97 is the max wage firms willing to pay that last worker hired after the tax is imposed. That is the intercept of the model. So we have the intercept of the model, 24.32. We have the 18.97, which is the maximum wage firms willing to pay after the tax is imposed. And we're multiplying that by the 15.274, right? That's the number of migrant workers, right? That's the number of migrant workers that are hired by these large low-cost firms, right? That's the amount that labor decreased by when the tax was put in place, right? And then the 34.98 was the tax burden. That was the tax burden of the firms, right? So we go back to our diagram here, right? We're calculating the large low-cost firm surplus, right, before the tax was in place. This little white triangle is the firm surplus of the high-cost small firms, right? The firm surplus of the low-cost large firms doesn't include that white triangle. It includes this green rectangle right here, this green one, the upper green rectangle, and this blue triangle, because this is the firm surplus prior to the tax to the low cost large firm, right? So we have to add that area. This area here, if you remember right, is 34.98, right? So we have to add that to this blue triangle, right? Which is what we did here, 75.84. So by changing this value here, right, I get the right number, 75.84, right? And then this number, after the tax is imposed, this upper green rectangle and this lower green rectangle, that's given to the federal government, right? The firm cuts the check to the federal government in this amount, right? This upper green rectangle plus this lower green rectangle. So this upper green rectangle represents the loss in surplus to the large low-cost firms. So their firm surplus reduces down to this blue triangle, right? And again, that blue triangle is found by the intercept of demand minus the highest wage firms are willing to pay that new last worker hired after the tax is imposed times the employment level after the tax imposed, which by assumption is just migrant workers, right? The number of migrant workers in the labor market. And that gives us 40.86, right? 40.86, that's where that comes from, right? So the payroll tax increase, on the one hand, reduces the low-cost firm's surplus, but on the other, it eliminates its competitors, right? So the low-cost firm is now in this labor market by themselves. Now they're the only company that hires labor from the labor market. So this policy has reduced their surplus by their tax burden, right? It reduces their firm surplus by the tax burden, but it means they don't have to compete anymore for labor in this labor market because it eliminates its competitors. Now, if its competitors were selling similar products, it eliminates the competition for the workers, right? Eliminates the competition for workers in the labor market. If those firms went out of business and they were selling similar products to the firm that stayed in, this large low-cost firm, then it also eliminates the competition in the product market, right? Now, before the payroll tax increase, migrant worker surplus was equal to what? Okay, so now remember this white triangle here, we've already calculated the area of this white triangle, right? And that is the worker surplus of native born workers, right? That is not included in the migrant worker surplus, right? Before the tax, then this right here, this quadrilateral right here, that quadrilateral was the worker surplus of the migrant workers, right? It includes this red area and then this green rectangle, right? It includes this green rectangle and this red area, right? Okay. So what does that equal to? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to calculate the area of this lower red triangle, right? This lower red triangle is the migrant workers' surplus after the tax, right? So we're going to calculate that first, right? So to calculate that, I need to find the height of the triangle, right? The height of the triangle is, let me just delete this. The height of the triangle is the 12.43. Well, we want to use only 2 decimal places. That's what got us in trouble last time, right? We want to use 2 decimal places in terms of dollars, right? So $12.43 per hour minus 2.5. That's the height of the pink triangle. We want to multiply that by the number of migrant farm workers. And the number of migrant farm workers is just the number of workers that remain in the labor market after the tax is imposed, right? Then we got to divide that by 2. Okay, so that's our work. We're going to copy it into our calculator here, our Desmos calculator. Okay, so the migrant farm worker surplus after the tax is imposed is this amount. That's a 4 there, right? The payroll tax increase results in a migrant farm worker of blank dollars before the tax, and then this amount after the tax. So what we have to do here is we have to recognize that this upper or this lower green rectangle, this larger green rectangle that is below this upper smaller green rectangle, this upper rectangle is the loss in worker surplus to migrant workers when the tax is imposed. And what was this area? This area we've already calculated, right? The area up here, the portion of the tax paid by low skilled workers, in this case migrant workers, is 64.91. So this green area here is 64.91 in my model, right? I have to add that to the worker surplus that prevails after the tax. I have to add the tax borne by the low skilled migrant workers. I got to add that tax revenue. Whoops, that should be 64.91, right? We're adding the 64.91 here, right? We're adding that. This right here is the worker surplus. That's the worker surplus after the tax, right? The red triangle. We're going to add to that the 64.91, right? This is the tax borne by, this is the share of the taxes that are borne by the workers, in this case, migrant workers, right? After taxes imposed, right? And that's because firms just offer lower wages, right? They can shed or share this tax burden with workers by just lowering their wages, right? So we're going to add that to the worker surplus of migrant workers after the tax to get the migrant workers surplus prior to the tax, right? So 140.75. Okay. 140.75 and then 75.84. Notice when I type this and I hit submit on this number here, I get this green triangle up here, right? And this green triangle is the worker surplus after the tax is imposed, right? The worker surplus before the tax is imposed for the migrant workers is this green triangle plus this rectangle created by this dash line and that dash line. So it's this whole quadrilateral, right? Okay. So this green triangle here is the worker surplus of the migrant workers after the tax is imposed. Okay. Now, overall, increase in the payroll tax results in a loss of efficiency equal to what? The loss of efficiency is this triangle that points to the original equilibrium, right? It includes the lost employer surplus, this upper triangle here that there's no line here, but there's this upper triangle here. That's the loss in firm surplus when the small high-cost firms exit this labor market. And this lower triangle down here, right? The lower triangle down here, below my cursor here, this triangle down here is the loss in worker surplus that results when the native workers all lose their jobs, right? And together, this is the loss of efficiency. This is the deadweight loss. Together, those are the deadweight loss. And to calculate that is you take the maximum wage firms are willing to pay. You take the maximum wage firms are willing to pay the last worker after the tax is imposed, right? That's 1897. And from that, you're going to subtract the reservation wage of the migrant worker with the highest reservation wage. And that is 12.43. Right? And so that's the height of the triangle that is formed by this dashed line and this part of the labor supply curve and that part of the labor demand curve. The width of this triangle is the employment level that prevails after the tax is imposed, subtracted from the employment level that prevailed prior to the tax being imposed, right? And that difference equals the number of native workers who lost their jobs, right? Then we got to divide by 2. And we get 21.41. 21.41. And when you enter this value here, it draws a red triangle here, right? And so this was the employment level before the tax. This is the employment level after the tax. We assumed the employment loss were the native workers, native-born workers lost their jobs. The marginal firm was were high-cost small firms. They went out of business or stopped hiring labor in this labor market. Maybe they moved to a different state or a different nation, right? They were eliminated from this market, right? The native workers were eliminated from the market, right? So if you draw a dashed line right to the equilibrium, this lower triangle is the loss and surplus that was accruing to the native workers. The upper triangle here would be the loss in employer surplus, firm surplus, that results in the high cost small firms from exiting this labor market, right? And together they make up the deadweight loss. The government is made better off here because they have this now large tax revenue they're collecting per hour, right? Most of it comes from the migrant workers, right? Most of it comes from migrant workers. Very little of it comes from the firms who are taxed. Why? Because they're able to shift the burden of the tax to the migrant workers by lowering the wage offers down to just above 12, right? So it did make the large low-cost firms worse off, but in the process of making them worse off by them losing this surplus to government in the form of their share of the burden of the tax, it eliminated their competition in the labor market, right? And if those firms that dropped out of this labor market also went out of business and were selling products similar to the products that this low-cost producer is making, the policy resulted in not only these firms not having to compete for the labor in this labor market, but it also eliminated their competition in the output market, right? So it's a big win for the low-cost large firm, right? You know, you can think of a firm like Philip Morris, right? Maybe all these government regulations and taxes on cigarette companies eliminate their competition, right? So one large cigarette company is left to sell cigarettes, right, to the United States population. And they don't have to face competition anymore, right? Okay, and in scenario 2, suppose instead of increasing the payroll tax employers pay, the government increases the payroll tax paid by employees. So let's go back to our model here. Okay, so we're gonna shift the tax from the employer, right? We're gonna shift the tax from the employer. We're gonna shift it to the employee. Okay. And notice what happens here. Notice what happens here. Instead of the demand curve shifting down here, right? Instead of the firm demand curve, the firm's labor demand curve shifting down to here, what happens is the labor supply curve, right? The labor supply curve shifts up here, right? It doesn't shift up. This is actually a decrease in supply, right? Because if you hold wages constant at the original, right? If you hold wages constant at 1668, if you hold wages constant there, what happens when we go from this black labor demand curve to this green labor demand curve? Well, what happens is employment falls, right? Employment falls from 21.82 down to 11.758, right? So the decline in employment means the black shifting from this black labor supply curve to this green labor supply curve represents a decrease in labor supply. So again, when you tax something, you get less of it. And what now is the maximum wage firms are willing to pay? Well, the maximum wage firms are willing to pay is still what? The maximum firms are willing to pay is still 1897. So it doesn't matter whether you tax the employees or the firms, right? The maximum wage firms are willing to pay for this last worker hired after the tax is imposed is 1897, right? What is the reservation wage of the last worker hired once the taxes are imposed on the employees? Well, the reservation wage is still 15.28, right? So that hasn't changed. Oops, sorry, 12.43. This is the employment level. The wage is 12.43, right? So that has not changed, right? And the difference between this maximum wage firms are willing to pay this now more scarce number of employees, right? From the reservation wage of the last employee hired after the tax is imposed, that difference is still 6.54, right? So the employment level is, whoops. The employment level is still, right? The tax still reduces employment level to 15.274, right? It still reduces to 15.274. Okay. And the tax, the difference in the 18.97 and 12.43 is still 6.54. So it doesn't matter who you tax, the employees or the employers, right? So now we're taxing instead of taxing the firms and demand shifting down to here, we're taxing the employees and supply decreases to this point here. It shifts to the left, right? Which pushes the wage up, right? It pushes the equilibrium wage up to 18.97, right? 18.97. Now the employees would like the employer to pay this tax, right? And it can only shift a little bit of the tax to the employer, right? Most of the tax they're still going to have to pay for, right? They're still paying a majority of the tax, right? Because when employers try to shift the tax off of the employer just net of the tax, right, passes just offers lower wages to the workers in such a way where the workers still have a majority of the burden, right? So the workers are trying to shift the tax to the employers, but the employers, they're less sensitive to changes in wages. The employees are more insensitive to changes in wages. Why? Because they're low skilled, right? When they're low skilled, they got families. They have to keep their jobs. They still got to put food on the table. They're maybe right at subsistence levels, right? So they got to pay the rent. They got to put food on the table, and so they don't have the luxury of exiting the labor market. So they have to just take it, right? So they accept this extremely low wage net of taxes, right? Okay, the burden of taxes on both workers and firms is not contingent on the side being taxed. Rather, it is determined by the elasticity of demand and supply. So we're going to calculate the wage elasticity of labor demand and of labor supply at the original market outcome, right? So at the original market outcome, we're going to calculate the elasticity, right? Okay, so let's go back here. And remember the elasticity calculation. Since the slope is 0.35 and 0.6.5, this represents the change in wages, the change in the wage rate over the change in employment level for employers. And this represents the change in wages over the change in employment level for employees. We can calculate the elasticities, if you remember, by taking the inverse of the slope, right? So the elasticity here is 1 divided by and we're going to do the demand one first. We're going to do the firm one first, 0.35. So what we've done here is we've changed the slope from the change in wages over the change in employment level. We've flipped it. So now this value here, 2.8571, yada, 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 this value now represents the change in employment over the change in wages, right? Because elasticity is the percent change in employment over the percent change in wages, right? So we have to invert the slope here. Now we're going to multiply that by the price quantity ratio. We're going to multiply that by the price quantity ratio at the equilibrium, right? Okay, and the price quantity ratio, or the wage employment level ratio, is what? The market wage initially was 16.68, right? And the employment level was initially 21.82. So labor elasticity, it's actually negative, right? Because the slope is negative. So the wage elasticity of labor demand is a negative 2.18, right? Okay, let's do the same thing for labor supply, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and copy this, and I paste it down here. And all I have to do, since at the equilibrium, right? At the initial equilibrium, the demand curve and the supply curve meet at the same point, right? So I can use this wage employment level ratio. I can reuse that, right? Recycle it. So all I have to do is change this down here to the slope of the supply curve, which is 0.65. And so the elasticity of labor supply, the wage elasticity of labor supply, is 1.18. Okay. And which one is closer to 1? Labor supply and labor demand are inelastic. They're inelastic if these values are between 0 and 1. The bigger the elasticity, the closer it is in absolute value to like really big numbers, the more elastic demand or supply is, right? So we can see from these elasticity calculations that labor supply, wage elasticity labor supply, is relatively more inelastic as it's closer to being between 0 and 1, where it would be inelastic, right? So both are elastic. Labor supply at the equilibrium and labor demand at the equilibrium are both elastic, but labor supply is relatively more inelastic, right? Since labor supply is relatively more inelastic, right? Let me move this down. Because labor supply is relatively more inelastic, employees bear most of the tax burden. And that's why it's not because it's of who's taxed, it's because employees are more insensitive to increases in wages, right?